Hello, my name is Buki Fatona. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. Welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo, an 8-part discussion series on topics in the intersect of philosophy of science and religion. You've mentioned colonialism in relation to science a couple of times. I wonder if you could say more about that.
Yeah. So this, I referred earlier on to this fairly modern distinction that has been made in Western science between um, meaning and power, or meaning and knowledge. The attempted divorce between those two, um, and if we look historically, uh, in terms of science, but particularly as theologians, which gives us a bigger time span, 2,000 years more, then though that distinction and the obsession with this question, are science and religion in conflict, is so tiny and so local in global terms. It's European and North American, and it's you know t- 200-300 years out of the last 2,000. This idea that we need to sort of prove the existence of non-physical things, that there is a distinction between material things and spiritual things. It's just not the way that most of the world works. And so some of the really exciting scholarship in my field is coming from people who they just don't bother with that question of, how do these two things fit together? They just, take it for granted that they do. So one of the people I've been reading quite a lot of recently is a guy called Chakanetsa Mavhunga. And he's done some really super work in modern day Zimbabwe, but he's also collected the work of other African scholars working in other places. And he's I guess his kind of his decolonizing intention is he wants to get away from these stories whereby Africa is kind of ignorant and empty of knowledge, and it needs to be given the scientific method, that it has no technology, and it needs to take on technologies that the West give it. He prefers the word innovation. For him, that's a kind of a uncolonized word, if you like, in some ways, and he looks at sort of historic ways of knowing and going about things amongst the Vashona people, and he just shows how what what I might be tempted to call the spiritual and the material are just absolutely interwoven. And not only that, he disrupts really profound categories. So he starts out talking about a thing that I might be tempted to call a technology, but it kind of becomes a verb in the way that he's describing it. So even those distinctions between objects and doings, or epistemologies, kind of become blurred, and they're just I think there's so much in this scholarship, and it just says, that's not the way we work, and we know that is true. Um, Western theologians are kind of getting excited at the moment about the idea that people are spiritual, not religious, and it's just so clearly true. Just these these meanings suffuse the world, and it's a very small and weird and abnormal group of people who want to parcel things out so strictly. um and okay, that's a big puzzle for them, and it's a real puzzle for them, but it doesn't have to be the puzzle that defines everyone's conversations.
Do you think that what role does colonialism have to play, or what do people who want to colonize, what do they have to gain in presenting science versus religion in a certain way? Is there that kind of a tact there? Is there something insidious behind the separation of science and religion? Something insidious that supports colonialism? I don't know enough about this, so it's a genuine question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I guess it's important to think about colonialism in two senses. One is the kind of the obvious physical sense of colonialism, whereby people either go and settle a country and kind of abuse the resources and the people there. But then there's the second level to colonization, which is about the stories that people bring with them as colonizers and leave behind them, whether they settle and stay settled, or whether they kind of go away and have changed that country, that people, very often having defined it as a country that in a different way than it was before. And it's the stories that they leave behind them, I guess. Well, no, maybe I'm interested. I guess as an STS scholar, I need to be interested in both of those. So by the stories that they leave behind them, I mean things like that there is a trajectory to progress. That this is what progress looks like. Progress looks like um, having machines to fix your problems. It means a particular idea of modernity, a particular idea of race, colorism. Those are obvious ways, but it's very often the more subtle sort of stories that get left behind. This is the right way of thinking. This is how we do it. That erase those kind of perhaps those kind of natural intercalations of meaning and knowledge. So what's in it for people who perpetuate that kind of conflict narrative I think some people are just sort of caught up in it in a way that they don't realize. They don't realize where that story came from, that it was a sort of a vindication of civilization against savage people with their savage and uncivilized beliefs. Um, they don't realize where it's come from. They're good-hearted people, but they just don't realize the effects of the narrative that they're wielding. For sure, there are people who have gains in it. If we look at someone I interviewed recently, is doing work as an agricultural educator in Zambia, and he's working with local farmers to recuperate the knowledge of heritage seeds that they have, working in the face of big agriculture, which wants to sell farmers solutions to climate change through their patented seeds that tie the farmers into an ongoing economic obligation, indenture, if you like, to those companies. They have to keep buying those seeds year upon year. They have to buy the chemicals that enable those seeds to flourish as they grow. So that is sort of saying, science is the solution to the problems that you have, and it just so happens that the shareholders in that company are not you and your friends. They live in Zurich or London or New York. So and also it just may not be the best kind of knowledge, right? Because here's where that kind of value and meaning come into play. So those farmers are recovering the seeds, the stories that go with the seeds, the knowledge, the life ways of their, grandparents who grew those seeds. They're planting meaning and value in a way that they never can be if they're planting those genetically modified crops. There's something much spiritually richer occurring there. So that I guess would be an example of how the divorce between, well, the supposed divorce between meaning and knowledge is doing active colonizing work. But it also has that powerful story with it. And and that's a great example of course, there's meaning and value in what those big agro companies are doing. The meaning and value is about the salvation that technology brings. It's this sort of myth that it's a neutral force. It's not a neutral force. The money is going into the pockets. The value and the meaning is literally the value. It's literally the share value. That is the meaning, that technology brings wealth. So that would be a good example, I guess.
So, in a sense, that divorce of meaning and from knowledge is in itself a pseudoscience. So, a take on looking at science as this objective practice, completely separate from religious practice, is itself a pseudoscience, like the pseudoscience of race, for example.
Well, uh, I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with that description because it sort of implies that there is a true science somewhere. Uh,
No, it's the view that science is always objective and
hmm.
somehow hovers above meaning
So
is the
I
wrong take on what science is.
so
So
100%.
it doesn't mean that there is something that does do that, actually. It's just that our perception is incorrect.
Yeah,
That's what I'm trying to say.
yeah, 100% I agree with you there that that story about science is a false story, and a dangerous story, and a damaging story. Um, I'm not sure that I would attach the label pseudoscience to it. I would just say that that is a bad account of science. But
Okay.
I wouldn't use the word pseudoscience because it implies that there is a kind of a true and
Yeah.
perfect science somewhere, which if we do it right, solves that problem. And science is as a human activity. There is not a like platonically perfect version of it somewhere that we can attain to. It's all a mixture of good or bad.
Yes.
Popper has been a really important figure in science, and as I hinted earlier, I think a lot of scientists would um, either name check him as the person who makes their work stand up philosophically, and a lot of people, even if they don't necessarily know him by name, if you look at the way that they write and talk about science, it's like Popper has got into their DNA. Popper was a philosopher who kind of got going in, I guess, the 1930s. He was Jewish, although and from a non-practicing background at a time where obviously that was very scary and dangerous in Europe. He eventually escaped Europe and spent the majority of his life in New Zealand and then the UK. He had a really neat solution to a big problem in philosophy. And that big problem is called the problem of induction. So we all know that there are some truths that we can prove kind of almost by the maths of logic. So famous example would be all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. So if both of those things are true, we know that Socrates must be mortal. Job done, no problem. But science doesn't generally work like that. Maybe maths. I don't know really anything about maths. Science doesn't really work like that, because we don't find those kind of nice logical propositions. We find we just make observations, and what we want to know is that always true? Is that always the case? The problem of induction is that you can observe something 99 times, but maybe if you just did it one time more, you'd see something different, and that wouldn't in fact be the case. That is the problem of induction. We can never know for sure. Is it true? Is it always like that? And Popper says, let's flip it around. Let's try and disprove things, because we can always disprove something, because we only need to see something different once to disprove it. So he says, actually, that's what we're doing in science. We're trying to disprove things. We're always setting up our experiments to try and disprove things. All we have as scientists is a collection of propositions that we haven't disproved yet. The more we've tried to disprove them, the more they kind of feel like they're probably right. But strictly speaking, heart of hearts, we know we've never actually for sure proved them. And this just is a kind of a game changer for so many scientists. In Popper's own day, people love this. So, for example, a group called the Theoretical Biology Club at Oxford, they latch onto this really early on. Some really famous figures from the history of mid-20th century science: Herman Bondi, who's a cosmologist; Peter Medawar, who's also a biologist, but not in the evolutionary sense, like the Theoretical Biology Club. And as I say, just kind of it's gone into the DNA of scientists ever since. And yet it kind of just doesn't actually seem like a really great account of science. That's not that really isn't. That's such a limited account of what scientists do. Um, particularly when it comes to technology. We're not trying to disprove things. We want to make a thing that works. But even within sort of more pure science itself, philosophers who are much cleverer than me have kind of really taken his theory apart on a philosophical level. They've sort of disproved this. But I'm sort of more interested in it from historical and sociological perspectives. Why did this really not very fleshed out account of science make sense for so many people? I would describe Popperianism as basic epistemological good manners, right? Obviously, obviously you want to check that you're not just kind of believing something on poor grounds. Obviously you want to check that, but that is just such a small element of what the whole business of science is. Now it's interesting. So I wrote an article about this a few years ago, and I got the most response from it from anything that I've ever written. A lot of really angry, all male, I have to say, scientists, or I don't know what they all were, really, really angry about this article, which really surprised me, but kind of made me feel vindicated that this stuff really, really matters to people, in a way that's quite surprising, and is worth figuring out what's going on. I think in one sense they misunderstood what I was doing in the article. So, like I say, there are already philosophers who have unpicked the validity of Popper's philosophy Duhem and Quine are two of the very famous ones. That work has been done. I wasn't trying to disprove his philosophy. What I was trying to answer was the question of why has it kind of gotten into the DNA of science, and is that a good thing or not?
In that article that you've just referenced, you said a powerful group of scientists and economists sold Karl Popper's falsification idea to the world, and they have a lot to answer for. And what do you mean by this?
Yeah. So what is this kind of very narrow account of science, that science is just about falsifying? What did that give to scientists? Now there's a few different answers to that question. And I'll miss out some of them, I think. Go read the article if you're interested. But one of the things that it does is it creates an incredibly modest account of what science is. All I'm trying to do is disprove things. Now let's think about the period in which Popper and his fans are operating. This is all around World War II. And after World War II, science begins to face a kind of a level of public scrutiny that it had not faced before because of the atomic bomb. So, so shocking. This is what the achievements of science amount to. This is where science takes us. And that epistemological modesty of Popperian falsification is very easily transmuted, if you like, into a kind of a moral deniability. All I'm doing as a scientist is trying to disprove things. I'm not trying to prove anything, still less trying to make anything. If we look at the period in which Popper was admitted to a fellowship at the Royal Society, which is kind of the biggest scientific honour, arguably, you can be given in the UK. This is in the middle, of that period of public scrutiny. Additionally, worries about kind of ecological damage were coming to the fore at that time, and he's just a really great figurehead for scientists who want to distance themselves from these critiques of science. It's a little bit more complex than that. I guess read the article if people are interested. But that's really the heart of it. And in the article, I look at, for example, the research of Peter Medawar and the way he accounts for his research, and particularly interested in the question of eugenics. So eugenics, as I'm sure people know, is the idea that you can turn kind of a Darwinian understanding of evolution and use it for the selective alteration of the human population. Very closely, of course, associated with racism, with anti-Semitism. But also to do with questions of ability / disability, and what kind of people are wanted in the human population. And that was very much still an active question within biology after World War II. But of course, what was necessary was to distinguish it from what the fascists, the Nazis, had done in Germany, to kind of cleanse the science, if you will, of that taint. So this chap Medawar, who is Popper's sort of biggest kind of biggest disciple, perhaps certainly in the UK, he does a lot of work to distinguish what he calls positive eugenics and which is the killing or sterilization of people that you don't want contributing to the population, versus what he calls negative eugenics, which is essentially a sort of trying to improve the population, allowing people to choose what kind of children they want to have or not. And he has this sort of really interesting sort of blurry argument where he says that positive eugenics is 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 unpopperian and Nazi, that it's so it's sort of unprovable that it improves the population, and anyway it's Nazi and it's bad. And then that kind of gives him space to create a liberal version of eugenics where parents have sort of the right to choose about the nature of the child that they're going to have. So it's kind of like, you know, it's a really murky, philosophically and morally murky kind of slippage that he's making there. But notice how liberalism, comes to the fore in the way that he frames the version of eugenics that he's happy to support. And that word is really a key pivot to also thinking about how Popperianism sort of sneaks into economics as well. So when Popper was at the London School of Economics, he was very close to Friedrich Hayek, who was a very sort of famous neoliberal economist. And the title of Popper's book about society, the open society, was adopted by George Soros, another neoliberal economist, as the name of his foundation. And there's kind of, again, a couple of sort of slightly overlapping ways in which Popperianism sort of hooks up to economics as well. First is that the way that Popper, very understandably coming from this, horrific fascist background, he wants to say that science needs to operate in an ideologically neutral space. Otherwise, it can't do its work. Otherwise, it can't test the things that it needs to test. It needs to be allowed to test those. But he also comes to be very much against Marxism. And so these neoliberal economists who are very much against socialism, as that sort of begins to emerge and continues to be a threat in the post-war period, they just kind of generally like everything that comes under that kind of badge of Popper because it helps them go against socialism. But there's also something about the actual content of what's in the bag that helps them. And it's this sort of idea, almost that science is the sort of free competition of theories, in the way that the market is kind of the about free competition as well. So there's kind of there's kind of slippage, again, philosophically, if we really analyze it, I think there's slippage, but it just kind of works. I think why this argument works, because that maybe sounds a little bit, is that really plausible, is what happens when we look from the 60s to the right nows, and we see that neoliberal, kind of ultra pro-capitalist people have been using Popperianism to try and attack science that threatens capitalism. And you can read this. This isn't my work. This is the work of a wonderful scholar called Naomi Oreskes in her book Merchants of Doubt. And she talks about how scientists were brought on board by major companies and then acted as lobbyists to government to try and poke holes in the science that linked smoking with cancer. And then those same people kind of went on to do the same work for climate change, and to say that, this isn't proven, there is room for doubt, this has not been falsified. So that for me is kind of the smoking gun of the moment, where where we see how the kind of the fellow traveling of economics and science under the label of Imperialism, has done real damage in the world. And like I say, it was really curious and noteworthy to me how angry people got about this article of, science carries on, whether or not Popper was right. It's a massive, power in the world. It accomplishes a lot of goods. But how close to people's hearts this is, I just thought that was really interesting.